Okay. Today we're going to talk about an emotion, a feeling, anger. And in our recovery program, we have to find ways to deal with feelings in a much different way than we've ever done before. If we've been involved in drinking behaviors or drug behaviors that somehow medicate or somehow smooth over our feelings, or even at times the use of mood-altering chemicals will increase and intensify certain emotions or feelings. Recovery means dealing with that kind of a feeling or emotion in a much different way. But in order to do that, we have to understand what the feeling or emotion is about. So let's take a look at one of the important emotions that we have to deal with, that people have a lot of trouble with because they don't understand it. Anger. What is anger? Got any idea what anger is? Anger is hostility, huh? Hostility, rage. Hostility, rage. Violence. Some people get into violence. And many forms of these kinds of emotions and feelings are expressed as we get into the anger process. Would you believe that there are times when people use anger in another way other than hostility, rage, and violence? In that sometimes we use anger, in fact, to get close. Anger is used to be intimate. Anger is used to get warm affection. Would you buy into that? Well, some people do this. Some people have learned in their family system that the only time somebody pays attention to them is when they're hurt or screaming or yelling or somehow make some kind of a direct, assertive overture. When you're happy and kind of content and doing your own thing, everybody else is so busy, they ignore you. You're just going about the business. I got other things to do. But you throw a temper tantrum and really cut loose, and people say, "What's wrong with you?" Well, at that moment, they're paying attention to you. At that moment, you've got their undivided attention. And then, if you get real mad and real hurt and then start to cry, what do people do then? Well, some people begin to hold you and kind of, "Oh, what's wrong? And can I take care of you?" And that's how, very subtly, you can get love, affection, or closeness with anger. Now, most of us associate this term anger with the violence and rage and temper. And many times we refer to this temper as temper tantrums. Or sometimes we say, "Oh, God, I lost my temper." That guy or that gal is always losing their temper. Alfred Adler, who's a Viennese psychiatrist, and I use that model of Adlerian therapy, made the statement one time, is you never lose your temper, you just choose to give it away, which I thought is kind of interesting. You choose to give it away. in the behavior, in the relationship. Now, there's some reasoning behind a statement like that. Losing your temper is a way of excusing our behavior. If I lose my temper, I can't be responsible for that. I just kind of lost control for a while, right? Which is a backhanded way of saying, don't hold me responsible for that. Well, you know how I am. I lose my temper once in a while, especially when I get drunk or whenever I get accused of something, or whenever you get bitchy with me. I have a right to lose my temper. You don't lose your temper, you see. You use it in a way. In that sense, you kind of give it away. But you see, if you take that approach, it's a choice to give it away, then you're faced with another issue that people don't like to look at, and that is, therefore, we have responsibility for how we use our anger. Our responsibility. And all of a sudden, the favorite phrase, "You made me mad," can't work anymore. Whenever something makes you angry, or you choose an angry response to a situation in a relationship, it is something that you have decided to do. It isn't something that someone made you do. So anger has all of those kinds of components to it. And anger has many definitions. In my research of the literature, the most common base I find in the literature is that anger tends to be an energy force set into motion as a result of some unfulfilled expectation. Something didn't come out the way we had hoped it would. And as a result, we get into many kinds of feelings as a result of that unfulfilled expectations. And those can be hurt. We get hurt about it, or sad, or we get surprised, or we get other kinds of feelings that go on in that situation, and that we tie it into behavior, which then, in fact, is angry. Now, we can intensify this hostility and this temper into a violent reaction. And many times, when we take a look at violence, and for what purpose is this behavior in terms of the anger response, we find that violence tends to have a similar pathology or a similar description of the behavior as does alcoholism and chemical dependency, in that you kind of get hooked on it. It is a form of irresponsible behavior, and it gets into a similar kind of delusional pattern where a person says, well, I can't help myself, I just get violent, kind of thing. And it passes over a reasonable kind of relationship into a delusional kind, a delusional pattern. The reasonable pattern says, you know, I'm angry at you, I'm mad at you, let's talk about it, I'm going to scream and yell or whatever, and let's work it out. The delusional part he says, I got a right to beat up on you, to treat you in the with physical violence, to physically harm you. And after having physically harmed you, you had it coming. Either because you were so bitchy or so nagging or so whatever, you're always doing things you're not supposed to do. You had it coming. A way to try to justify the anger. So whenever we're dealing in our recovery with this kind of anger, we generally get into the same issues of the delusional thinking and the crazy thinking, and as we do in the recovery of chemical dependency. You got to treat it the same. And that becomes a dilemma because, you know, with alcoholism, if that's what the diagnosis is, we say, okay, you quit drinking. But with violence, you're going to never be mad again? Never ever get angry again? Well, that's dumb. People get angry. People get angry all the time. But it's learning to use your anger and the feeling of hurt and sadness and remorse and all those feelings that go along with anger in a responsible way. Responsibility means mutual respect. Responsibility means I respect your rights and your feelings, and I respect my right to do the same, to express those feelings. But it's done in a way in which we can respect one another, are known as mutual respect. Now, there are many ways that we're going to develop our thoughts and our thought pattern in this looking at anger patterns. There are many ways to deal with anger. And we learn this in our families, for the most part. There are some families where anger is dealt with and just exploding all over the place. Screaming and yelling and throwing stuff, and dishes and plates go flying through the air, and drawers are slammed. And from all of that chaos comes one conclusion. Somebody's mad. Oh, they're at it again. They really go at it, you know, and they're screaming and yelling and all kinds of stuff. And it's that kind of anger and that kind of rage that we many times associate with the definition. And then there are some family systems whereby when people are really good and ticked off, they get quiet. And they get that certain position and glare. And you know, don't cross them. Because if you do, big trouble. They are mad. Now there's something about that behavior that's very interesting. In order to pull it off, in order to let people know that you're mad, you got to get in a position so they see you. It's got to be something that you visibly observe. And they let you know. They do it right in front of you. And they do it in such a way, even with the most subtle glance or subtle emotional phrase, a feeling, a behavior of some kind, you know. And sometimes, kids pick this up very fast. They know what to do. Kids are very adept at picking up behaviors and feelings. And usually when we talk about temper tantrums, we're talking about kids. Usually, 2, 3, 4-year-olds. You ever see any 3 or 4-year-olds throw a temper tantrum? Adler says that children use anger or temper tantrums to conquer their parents by terrorizing them. And it works. They conquer, and they get away with it. What do parents do? Oh, they run over and, oh, don't do this, and what's wrong? And in therapy, I say, leave them alone, walk out of the room. Don't give them an audience. And the next response is very interesting. But if I do that, he'll destroy the whole house. He'll bust up all the furniture. But if that's not terrorizing and intimidating, I don't know what you call it. And not only that, it has worked. So we use anger to terrorize and sometimes to intimidate. And the phrase temper tantrum is nothing more than using anger in a behavior to the degree that intimidates or terrorizes somebody. And once we learn the intimidation works, then we don't have to pull the tantrum off anymore. All we have to do is threaten to have one. Ever see a kid go like that, and their parents say, oh, no, come on, don't do that. And he gets away. That is learned behavior. Once a person finds out it works, they will continue. Now, it's rare that we see that kind of temper tantrum in adults. Somehow we begin to socialize ourselves in a more reasonably responsible way to deal with feelings in a more, what we call, adult fashion. That's not true. All we do is become a little more proficient at it. We get very good at throwing a temper tantrum. And now, we're not going to lay on the floor and kick and scream, because that's not very good for a 25-year-old to do. Doesn't make too much sense. In fact, they may lock you up, so we're not going to try that one. But there are other more subtle forms of that behavior with the same base. One form of that is depression. And depression, by some clinicians, has been defined as a silent temper tantrum. A silent temper tantrum. Anger that is so internalized and buried and within the individual, and yet it's designed to hook into somebody, to give somebody a bad time, to terrorize them, to intimidate them, and to really make it miserable for somebody. But it's still a temper tantrum. Violence and rage is a temper tantrum. And many times people have learned that one way of excusing their behavior, thereby not being held responsible for their behavior in anger and violence or hostility, is to get drunk. Because you know what I do when I get drunk. You know I'm liable to bust up a bar, I'm liable to start a fight, or I'm liable to tip over a few things. You know, that's just me when I'm drinking. When I'm not drinking, you know, I'm a nice guy, I'm sociable, I'm friendly. So when I do that in my drinking, that really isn't me. Well, my question to that person at that point is, well, then who the hell is it? It's got to be somebody. It, in fact, is you. And sometimes we use alcohol or mood-altering chemicals to, in effect, justify our behavior, which we intend to do anyhow, and then to excuse it, kind of buy it off. Now, anger gets into our relationships. It gets into how we relate with one another. And if it's the kind of thing of where you're just on the job, or with your friends, you may handle anger in one way. However, when it gets into the family and the intimate closeness of family relationships, we find that anger takes on other courses, other avenues. For example, we get two people who are involved in the close, intimate kind of relationship. And they're in their marriage or in their relationship, and one of them says, hey, I'll tell you about this thing, anger. I've attended several seminars and workshops on anger, and I've learned a lot about it. And here's what I'd like to do. You know, when you're angry and really upset with somebody, I've learned to express it, get it out. Expression means from the internal out, to get it out. And anger, by the way, comes from a Greek-based word called angere, A-N-G-E-R-E. And what that word meant was to choke off or stifle. So anger, the word itself, comes from a base that says, stuff it, man. Choke it off. Like Archie Bunker says, Edith, stifle yourself. Just stuff it. So this guy said, I've learned how to really get it out, express it, bounce it off the wall. He says, I may scream or yell for 5 or 10 minutes and really get it out, but I'll tell you something. About 5 minutes after that's all over with, I'm okay. I'm lovey-dovey. I want to cuddle. It's okay. And we'll be friends. I'm fine. What do you think about that? She says, I hear you. I understand every word you're saying. But whenever somebody gets angry like that, or they're really teed off, I want to think about it for about 4 days, and then I'll let you know. I suppose those two are going to get along. And it's interesting in that interaction, which of the two is the more powerful? In a sense, even though it's explosive and somehow intimidating, and somehow I get a little anxious about it, the person who is really blasting and getting it out there and putting it right out front, you can deal with that. But that strong, silent, retiring, holding it back in, and you know damn well it's there. You know that anger is there. And it goes on and on and on. And it just doesn't come out. Now, sometimes there's a reason for that. We use anger to express our hurt, and since we're hurt, I'm saying I'm going to keep you right there. I'm going to defend myself. So in this context, anger becomes one of our defense mechanisms whereby we keep ourselves from getting hurt. And you know, if I'm mad enough, that to leave me alone. In fact, many times the statement is made, leave me alone, I'm mad. What that means is back off. Get away from me. I want distance, I want space, I want you off my back. Sometimes that same behavior is used in retaliation to punish. If you do that to me and if you get angry with me, I'll fix you. I'll fix you. And so there is that kind of retaliation that gets into a relationship. Now we play that off in all of our relationships in one form or another. If you examine the various relationships you have in life in terms of anger, it might be interesting to you to check off the different ways in which you express your anger. And let me give you just a few examples that you can check off yourself. How do you relate to your spouse or to your boyfriend or girlfriend or loved one when you're angry? Okay, well that might be, well, I let her have it, or I really get it out, or she knows me well enough not to get me too upset, or he knows if he gets too angry, I'm not going to be with him for a few days. So that kind of thing. Well, how do you deal with your anger then with your friends? Oh, well, we get along a lot better together. We can handle it. We can talk it out. Well, that's interesting. With your friends, you have a kind of respect for the relationship that you can talk it out. In fact, if we treated our friends the same way we treat our intimate family members sometimes, we wouldn't have any friends. They'd just say, forget it, Mac. I don't need that crap. So we learn another way to deal with our anger with our friends. And then the third situation you may want to consider is, how do you deal with your anger on the job? When the big boss walks in and you just steamed up butter and hell. Do you dare walk up and say, hey, Charlie, I don't like the way you run your cotton picking company. I think it's kind of crappy policies. I think you ought to shove it. I don't think so. Because most people say, oh, I couldn't say that. I couldn't deal with my anger that way. But we do it in other situations. Now, what do these three examples mean? It means very simply that we, in fact, do have a choice. In fact, we do make choices. And in fact, we do make those choices usually based on the kind of behavior we think we can get away with. And we know damn well we can't get away with it with the boss. We might get canned. We might get fired, and I don't want to do that. But the same, so I will respect that situation with the boss and not upset it. But we don't take that same kind of respect in the most intimate, caring situation we have. And that's with the family. And somehow, well, they're supposed to know. They're supposed to understand. They're supposed to realize. Really? I'd like to repeat what I said a moment ago. If we treated our friends and sometimes our employers the same way we treat some of our real close, intimate family members, we wouldn't have jobs very long. And we wouldn't have too darn many friends. So take a look at that for a minute as you examine your anger. Now, anger serves several reasons, several sources. I've written down some definitions of anger that are interesting. They're in the on the blue sheet in your material. Like the first one is that anger is an energy force set into motion by unfulfilled expectations. That's the usual base of the definition. And Adler said that feelings and emotions are developed in the direction and to the degree required for the attainment of a particular goal. Now, that's what I've been talking about. In the direction and to the degree for the attainment of a particular goal. So we will use a certain amount of anger, pump it up to the intensity or the degree we assume it will take to get our goal accomplished. Now, that depends upon you, if you're in the relationship with me. Because some of you will be kind of complacent and laid back and kind of sitting there. And if I really wanted to get your attention, I'd have to come right at you. And I'd have to figure, in order to get through and get your attention, I'd blast it right in there. And man, that's the degree I have to increase the emotion to get my point to you. And you will say, what are you so mad about? Why are you so angry? We're just talking about a friendly issue. Well, I had to pump this thing up enough to get my intended goal through. On the other hand, other people might be sitting right up there nose to nose looking right at you, and you don't have to scream quite so much. You don't have to intensify it. You don't have to pump up the anger. And then you might ask the question, well, why when you nose to nose like this, all of a sudden somebody gets teed off and lays one on you? And that gets into that intimidation and control and backing somebody off to get your own way again. So it's in the degree, or to the degree required for the attainment of a particular goal. Adler also says that anger is used by those ambitious persons who do not want to alter themselves, but only to change others. I think that's an interesting statement. I'm not going to change my behavior. I'm all right. You're not behaving the way I want you to, so I want to change you. And one way to change you is to intimidate you. And I have learned that with a certain degree of anger and a certain degree of pumping up that feeling, I can get what I want from you. And I can pull it off. Hugh Prother says the insanity of holding back my anger is that evidently I'm more willing to risk destroying me than destroying the relationship. Now, in this statement, we see the interactional dynamics. And many times, I will stuff my anger. I will put it wherever in my guts. And I will risk destroying me because I'm afraid if I put it out there, I'll destroy the relationship. How can I destroy the relationship? You may leave me. You may walk away. You may abandon me. Another thing that people say is, you can't handle it. If I laid this anger on my wife, she'd fall apart. She would have a nervous breakdown. She can't handle it. Well, people don't break down and fall apart all over the floor. I've been a therapist for 30 years and I haven't seen anybody fall to pieces yet. They get upset and they get aroused and they get all kinds of emotional feelings, but they don't fall apart all over the floor. And sometimes that statement, he or she can't handle it, really can be interpreted as, I can't handle it. I can't handle the anger. I can't handle using it in a relationship. I don't want to be responsible for it. So in order to handle that feeling, I don't want to admit that myself, I will do the projection and say, she can't handle it. Therefore, I don't have to tell her. I don't want to risk destroying the relationship. So out of all these kinds of things, I've come up with a definition that I use most frequently in my therapy and working with people, and saying that anger is an emotion expressed in a behavior, meaning I won't accept that. That's that unfulfilled expectation. That's something happening. I'm not going to buy that. I'm not going to accept that. Therefore, my anger says more about me than it does about you. Anytime you build up that kind of anger, that kind of emotion, that's saying something about you. That's something you have chosen. That's something you have picked. And so it says something about me. Again, I reflect back on something I said previously. I will then use it selectively in varied other kinds of relationships and or situations. Because I have learned that there are some places I can get away with anger. There are some places I can become very enraged. I can show my temper. I can really, really be hostile. And there are other places I've learned I got to stuff it. And so the last part of this lecture is going to be on functional ways to deal with that anger, and functional ways to deal with stuffing it so it doesn't become an ulcer, or it doesn't get into other kinds of physical disorders and headaches and muscle disorders, so that we can be more responsible with our anger responses. Anger is something, as I've said, that we have learned. It is a part of a family system phenomena. And having learned this in our family, we tend to carry this into our other kinds of relationships. What I plan to do in the second part of this film is to go into the various parts of the system and take a look at the system as we have learned it, and see what happens when we bring those perceptions into our relationships. Because what characteristically follows then is that we then pick up on those behaviors and then teach our friends, our close relationships, our children, whatever, that which we believe. That's what Adler called our own private logic. We develop our own system of what's real or what's not real. What's acceptable in the use of anger and what is not acceptable in the anger response. And what we will do is take a look at a family system. And I'll make one up as we go along. And you compare that with your family system and see how those subtleties play themselves off. I'm going to take a break now, and we'll go into the second part of the family system and then the recovery part. Okay, now we're going to take a look at some of the value systems that we've learned and how we learn those. And as we go along, maybe some of these examples will apply to you in your particular situation. Anytime I'm analyzing a particular use of a feeling or an emotion. I, for the most part, like to do this as it expresses itself in a relationship between two people. So this example will draw upon a relationship and how people learn to express themselves with one another in this relationship. Basically what I do, and you can do this with a friend, is to divide this into a system of let's say, George and Mary, okay? And we want to find out how George and Mary are going to get along in a relationship using anger, either in fighting or working out issues, or however they're going to get along using this emotion of anger. Now, with George, what I'll ask him first is about his father. What did father do when he was angry? And let's develop this as we go along and see what happens. Father was quiet. He was stern. He was firm. He was exact. And those kinds of things when he was angry. But you knew he was angry because of these kinds of things. And what did mother do? Oh man, she would scream, and she would yell, and she would throw things, and she would threaten. Oh, she would put on an act that would open up on Broadway. She'd really let it out, really. I said, all right, which one of them would spank? Well, Dad, he'd spank. He'd do it. You knew that if he pushed that too far, big trouble. Now, the question is, what did you do or how did you feel when these things happened? What did you do when Dad was quiet and you knew he was angry? Well, I'd avoid him. You get the heck out of there. I'd avoid him. When he was stern, I would quietly listen. I just kind of back off and leave that thing alone. I'm not going to touch that. When he was firm, I get scared. Oh, I get scared of him. I get scared. I wouldn't know what to do with that. And when he was exact and one of the things just precise, I get nervous. I wouldn't know what to do with that. Okay? What would you do when he spanked you? Well, it hurt, you know, but I'd tolerate it. I'd tolerate it and go, okay, I got by that one. All right? Now, when Mother got angry and she'd scream, what would you do? I'd ignore her. Everybody knows what she was like. She'd scream and yell, and it didn't mean a heck of a lot. He'd just ignore it, and I'd get out. I'd get out of the way. I'm not going to mess with that. Well, what did she throw things? Well, of course I'd duck. Yeah, hell, there's no problem there. I'd just duck it and kind of leave and get out of the way. And when she'd threaten me, How would you feel when she threatened you? Oh, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. Okay? Now, you can see what's happening so far. As George develops a system here based on real data in his early childhood. It does not mean that the early childhood experience was a predisposition of how he behaves today. It doesn't mean that conditioned him. What it means is he learned from this behavior from father and mother ways to respond to it and learned how to deal with it, giving those conditions. So it's a learned kind of thing based on your view of the situation, which I call your private logic, your own view of life. Now, we turn to Mary and say, okay, Mary, what did your father do when he was angry? Oh, he would throw a tantrum, he'd yell, he'd spank, he'd get drunk, and he was pretty violent. Pretty violent. I was scared. I was scared of him. All right? Now, what did mother do when she was angry? Well, she was quiet. She'd suffer. She'd be a martyr, you know. She complained, but she wouldn't do too much about it. And she'd tell Dad. You see, now some of us come from that kind of a system or a relationship, and know some of those things. Now we ask Mary, how did you feel when Dad would throw a tantrum? Oh, I get scared. I get scared. And what would you do when he would yell? I'd promise to be good. I'll be good. I'll be good. If you just don't spank me, I'll be a good girl, you know. I'll really be good. What would you do when he did spank you? Well, I'd cry, and I kind of had it coming, and then I'd pout for a while. And what did you do when he drank and you knew he was angry? Oh, I get very frightened because I know what was going on, and when he got violent, I'd hide. I'd hide or run away. I'd hide and run away. Well, what would you do when Mom got quiet, when she was angry? I'd try to console her. And when it looked like she was in her suffering, well, I want to cheer her up. And when she would complain, well, I'd be that good little girl, and I'd listen to her. I'd listen to her. And when she'd tell Dad, well, I'd try to get her not to. I'd try to talk her out of it. I'd try to talk her out of it. Okay? And so basically so far all we've done is to take George and Mary apart, go back into their early experiences and find out from their memory what they learned. However, an interesting thing now happens. The material right in here now becomes the basis of the family system that these two will use in their relationship together. Now you will be able to walk into that relationship and pick it apart and know some of the very private, intricate, intriguing parts that go in the family system. And most of all, they can see it. If you will do this on your own, in any relationship, and just follow this simple pattern, you'll begin to see what happens when you two get together and start your anger or your frustration, or you're trying to dialogue something. What will George do when Mary gets mad and really wants to lay one on him? Well, with women, he's going to ignore them. Get out of the way and duck. Right? They don't mess with that. That's what women do anyhow. Right? And she's going, well, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be consoled, and I'm supposed to be listened to. You're supposed to talk to me, you turkey. What do you mean you ignore me and duck? Ain't gonna work. Well, it'll work for me, you know. So all of a sudden we see, wait a minute, this ain't gonna work. And when George gets angry at Mary, what's he gonna do? He's gonna avoid her. He's gonna just quietly deal with this thing and kind of pull off and do his own thing. He may land one, you know, explosive, anger, intimidation, lay one out there, but he's a little bit scared about his anger, and he's not going to admit it, even though he may use it. And he may use it to hurt her, because he feels hurt. And what's she going to do when he gets that angry? Oh, she's going to promise to be good. She may cry a little bit and pout. She may try to keep this thing together. She'll become frightened, you see. And she may run away if he increases the anger to the violent part. She won't be able to handle that. But what will happen in the running away and hiding to avoid the hurt of the violence, we get into a phenomena that most people do not like, and that's called abandonment. Nobody likes to be abandoned, whether it's physical or emotional abandonment. We don't like that, right? So now we try all these cute little games again. And in my example, the games that many play are being good, compliance, promises. You know, promises are an attempt to reconcile. Reconcile. But then what happens is we never get in to understand the dynamics or really what's going on inside. So even though the promises have all good intentions, the intention of keeping the relationship intact, unless you understand what happened in the reaction, you'll repeat the same thing again, and you say, well, your promises are no good. I can't believe your promises. But remember, the promise at the moment is valid. And usually that is to avoid the abandonment feeling or reaction. But let's get back to our family system. This now becomes the important issue in the relationship between George and Mary. And it doesn't take you very long to sit down and graph this out. many times it's more helpful and more accurate with a third party doing it with you, because you tend to, if you do it yourself, you tend to feed through your own distortions and through your own misconception. But that's all right. Just get these things down, because then you can begin to see what you do in this relationship. Now, having looked at that, what you do in this relationship is what you teach your kids or other people about you. And so now that gets passed on, so that now the children of George and Mary will come out of their relationship and learn some of the same patterns. That's why we tend to pass these on from generation to generation, not because they're inheritable, they're not. They're learned patterns. And they're learned because, and they're carried on, not because they're functional necessarily, because we've learned successfully how to deal with them. You have to be so careful with this pattern, because when someone is very kind and gentle and understanding and accepting and supportive, when you're used to this kind of screaming and yelling and violence and temper, it feels good for a while, but then what's your next question? I wonder when they're really going to let loose. So even though the situation comes out of a warm, close, intimate commitment, you're ready for the screaming, yelling, intimidation, that which you've been used to for so many years. And if that doesn't come about, many times, suddenly we'll provoke it. We'll finally get somebody so mad that they'll get frustrated and say, I'm teeing off at you. And you say, see, I thought that was underneath there all along. And so it becomes what Adler called a self-fulfilling prophecy if you're not careful. You got to be very careful about that. That's why many times we get into some recovery, we use affirmations. I'm a good person, I'm a likable person, I have warm relationships, I expect warm relationships, and people say, ah, come on, that's pie in the sky, that's fantasy, that's not real, that's dumb. But basically what all of those kinds of affirmations do is to open your eyes for the possibility of those affirmative behaviors to continue. Because those people who are so negative entrenched, that's all they look for. That becomes the narrow, myopic view of life that says, this is the way it is. And I can have all the nice situations face me right in a row. I'll go right on by them and find somebody who is hostile and angry and violent, because, aha, I know how to handle that. I've learned. So this plays itself off in the family system. And if you use this kind of a graph, you'll be able to understand then how to pull this off and how to write out your own scheme. Once you get it down, then you can make a decision how or if you want to change it. How you can change that perception. Sometimes you can do it by an understanding, self-taught, self-educated way. Sometimes it takes therapy. And therapy is nothing more than consciously and deliberately trying to break into these old patterns. consciously and deliberately making a therapeutic intervention into these old patterns of behavior so that they can change. That's what therapists do. That's what I do. They help you break those. And so once the new behavior comes about, then you can have a new relationship. There's an interesting thing in recovery. One of the critical issues in changing behavior is that if George changes this behavior, what does Mary have to do? She's going to have to change too. The relationship can no longer stay the same. Now, the relationship has been based on this sometimes for many years. And that changing and growing together out of learning these principles of dealing with their anger, that's where a new relationship begins to build. Because you see, in our courtship and our dating people and getting to know them to pick intimate relationships, we do some strange things. Some of the strange things that we deny, we project, we just don't want to take a look at some of the behavior. And when we're dating and all of a sudden a couple comes in, for example, for marriage counseling about 3 years after marriage. And she said, one thing I can't stand is that when he gets angry, he just explodes and he bellers and he does all kinds. He never did that when we were dating. He said, I did too. I've always been that. I learned that. I learned that in my family. What do you mean I never did that? And what happens is she's done one of two things. And we all do these things. Either in the courting process, when we're on our best behavior, we see some behavior like that that frightens us. We say, well, I'm going to pretend that didn't happen. He's really not that way. I got such a nice thing going with him. I don't want to confront him. Now, not all this is conscious, but we go through this denial. He's really not that way. Or the second, equally as dangerous process says, well, obviously, after we're married and he's so committed and loving to me, he'll change, right? He'll change. Well, there's a rule in relationships that says what you see is what you get. And we don't always take a look at that. We don't always buy into that, and we kind of rationalize it or deny it or hoping it'll change. And all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but it does creep up. It rears its ugly head in the relationship. And now we got to deal with what's going on between George and Mary in the family system. It's important to look at that system. It's important to examine that system in the intimacy of the relationships that you have. I've used this same system to analyze relationships on the job. How two people get along, or three people, or a staff. Now that will transpose itself in other areas of your life once you begin to see how it plays itself off. By the way, this diagram, this system, will also help you understand why it is that having gotten into one hurtful, harmful, extremely destructive marriage, you finally say, that's it. I'll never put up with that kind of behavior again. I will never find somebody with that kind of anger. I will never walk into violence. And the next marriage is what? Violence and rage, and I got in the same cotton picking mess again. How do I do that? You do that by keeping intact the same perception, the same logic, the same sense, the same such as life system. And you go out and you find somebody unconsciously and certainly unintentionally that fits that same mold. Unless you make a conscious and deliberate attempt to change these perceptions. And that's where it's going to have to come from. As you have a better awareness and understanding of yourself. This again does not mean that father and mother dictate it. What it means is you learn from that. And you can choose to copy, imitate, or follow these behaviors, or you can learn that these behaviors, even though they work for them, I'm not going to touch them. You know, some people get into relationships like this because they do work. Because they have learned to be the quiet, submissive, suffering one. And the only way you can pull it off is to find somebody who will do a tattoo on your nose. And there are a lot of people around who will agree to do that. And then all of a sudden, you get into that relationship and you say, hey, I'm not going to be the quiet, submissive martyr anymore. How's that grab you? I'm going to be myself and stand up for myself. It blows the relationship wide open. The other one says, what do you mean? You know, I've been doing this, or whatever. Whenever one person changes that significantly, the other person has to do something about that change. And that's what awareness is all about. Now, what can we do about handling our anger in a more positive or constructive way? There are several things we can do. The main thing, as I've focused on this whole lecture, is to understand yourself. Understand your own set of values. And take responsibility for yourself in that set of values. I have a list here of 10 things you want to consider in a more functional way of looking at your anger. The first one says, own yourself. You are what you say, what you do, what you think, and what you feel. Your feelings are as individual as your footprints. No person is responsible for them but you. My whole lecture has been based on the fact that you create these feelings based on the data of relationships where you learn these reactions. But they are your choice, of your own choosing, and you are responsible for them. Number 2, usually, anger usually follows another feeling, such as frustration, fear, or hurt, which goes by unrecognized. Learn to notice the other feelings first. Too often, or most of the time, somebody is really busting out with anger, and the first question another person says is, how come you're so mad? How come you're so angry? What's got you so teed off? That's not the right question. That's not the right question. We try to get to another feeling, because anger never exists alone. There is always another feeling or a group of feelings attached to it, usually unrecognized. So number 3 says, now try to express that feeling in words. To be hurt or afraid or frustrated is to be human. Now, it makes it much more functional if someone says to me, why are you hurt? Or are you disappointed? or has something happened, then why are you angry? Why are you so mad? It's a whole different way of dialoguing and opening that up, yes.
If this feeling is unrecognizable at that moment, how does an individual deal with that?
It usually is unrecognizable because we haven't practiced this more functional way. The point is to begin to look for it and to begin to open up opportunities to let it come out. The first thing we're going to pop onto is the anger.
Anger is the end result of another cause.
It'll come out that way in the expression, but they exist side by side. And it's an interesting way, the way it comes out in family systems. If you learned anger is the way to go and never show that you're hurt or never cry, anger will show on top and the hurt will go underneath. On the other hand, if the family system taught you, don't you ever raise your voice and don't you ever say anything about your anger or rage, the hurt will come up on top and the anger will go underneath. That which you have learned is socially acceptable. But the point is, they exist simultaneously, and you have to take time and effort to consciously look at those other alternatives. Number 4, accept anger as one way people get what they want. That's not the only way and certainly not the best way. What you achieve with a temper tantrum is control over another person, not cooperation. That's what I referred to during this whole lecture as the intimidating part of anger. It works. You can control somebody very quickly. You can back them right into a corner. All you have done, however, is to exercise your control over that situation for that moment through the use of anger as intimidation. Never does it result in cooperation. It means submission on their part and superiority on your part. That's all it means. 5, try to see people in a different light. Instead of assuming that they are behaving in certain ways to hurt or anger you, realize sometimes it's the only way they know how to act in stressful situations. Many times people will express the stress reactions in life through anger. And stress occurs around us all the time. A basic way of dealing with stress, again, is the same way dealing with anger. Understand it. Take a look at the stress factors that are working in your life. Even though you think, well, there's one here and one here and one here and one here, I handle all of those. Well, and handling all of those, each one of those took a toll in your emotional expenditure, and they will build up. And learn to look at those stress factors, because many times they will build up and come out, as we say, sideways with your anger or rage. 6, when you're around someone being angry, try to listen to the other's angry words. Try not to listen to the other's angry words, but the feelings behind the words. So you can use this knowledge to try to understand somebody else. What do you hear? Do you hear the stress? Or do you hear the pain? What's there? That doesn't mean you're going to give in to it, or that you're weak or helpless or mamby-pamby. You're trying to understand and trying to deal with an emotion in a more responsible way. 7, the way in which you become angry and what you do with such feelings are both habits. The habits as you learn from this behavior in the early life. Now, when someone says to me in therapy, well, that's just a habit of mine, that usually means, and I don't plan to change it either. We get the habits are excuses. And I want to take a look at them in ways that said, okay, that's what I learned. Now, how can I change that? If you regularly let out steam by yelling at someone else, throwing a plate, or hitting your child, see it for what it is. A habit which can be unlearned if you choose to change it. In some cases, the unlearning may require the help of a professional. The reason for that is we get so locked into our own private logic that that becomes a fact for us. We don't know other alternatives. Professionals help us see those alternatives, but also help us go back to understand where we learned it. Number 8, physical exercise relieves tension. It can help reduce the strain of a bad day at work or a quarrel with a spouse, but it's never the whole answer. Why is that? Because you haven't dealt with the issue that caused the unfulfilled expectation, the thing that caused the disappointment or resulted there. So you can go out and jog, and you can do those kinds of exercises that really are okay. They're extremely beneficial, but also you got to find a time to deal with those issues of conflict. Number 9, saving up minor irritation for one big argument will not prove as much healthy relief as dealing with them one at a time as they occur. Now, that doesn't mean that every time you get miffed, you sit down for 10 minutes and talk it out. You may not have that kind of luxury, but it does say that you don't wait until 2:30 on Saturday afternoon to settle all your quarrels, because usually they are blown out of proportion, or they don't have the same significance by Saturday afternoon at 2:30, or you forget certain things. And but it does mean that you must consciously get to a posture where you look at these issues and begin to process them responsibly. Number 10, after you become angry, do not drive around a while to cool off. Walk around or run around or talk it out, but avoid using machinery of any kind. The automobile may seem to be a convenient, anonymous escape hatch. For the angry driver, it has a hazard to his own safety and to the well-being of those around him. You have to get out, soup up that 300 horses and take off. I'm going to get the next guy. That's not very responsible. Other things you can do in looking at your relationship is to take some inventories, see where the source of anger is coming from, and learn to recognize the feeling of anger. Anger and fight rules at the bottom of the page. Learn to recognize the feeling of anger, and that anger is okay. Sometimes we do a guilt trip on ourselves that anger is not okay. Recognize that anger is okay. Explore why you are angry and upset. This cannot be done objectively when you are angry, though. But then sometime talk about that with that person and say, how do we get into these things? And what can we do different? We together. Well, they say, well, one thing we could do is you wouldn't get so mad. Well, that's blaming you for your behavior. We're looking for behavior options together as we learn to relate differently with one another. Explore to find situations that are similar to the original source of your anger, when you thought there was no reason to become angry. So these kinds of things, say, well, everybody's a nice guy, or you should never get angry with somebody. Explore the feelings and situations revealing hurt or fighting that you previously experienced during the marriage to an alcoholic. In other words, something could have happened in the past relationship that triggers that emotion now, and you put the same feeling or behavioral sequence on that person, and they won't understand where it's coming from. It won't make any sense to them. It makes perfect sense to you because that's part of your logic. But the other person thinking you're coming out of left field will not understand that. Now, some of the reasons we use for not dealing with our anger are real because we make them real. Some of those reasons are we fear we're going to be rejected, we fear that someone's not going to like us, or fear of losing control. If we're not angry, we won't be geared up enough to keep control over the situation. Or we're afraid we're going to be counterattacked if we become quiet or complacent. Or we're afraid of hurting other people. Or we're afraid of being hurt by others. Or we're fearful that anger is not acceptable to others. Or we're fear of feeling guilty after we express our anger to others. Many times we do feel very guilty when we get into something like that. And very briefly, I'd like to give you my definition of guilt. Guilt is the feeling we have for the good intentions we never really had in the first place. People don't like to take a look at that either. If we had the good intentions to change the behavior, we'd change the behavior and not feel guilty. It's all over with. I learned from that experience. But guilt says, well, I always feel guilty when I do that. Which says, I'm going to do it again, folks, and I'm going to keep doing it. I'm not going to change that behavior. So there are many ways that we can find in our own relationships together to deal with this emotion of anger much more functionally. The two basic things you need to look at are your own acceptance. One is the acceptance of anger as something that is a fact. It's neither positive nor negative till you put it in use. But if you use it responsibly, then it can become a very important vehicle in your relationships together. And secondly, the point of anger never exists by itself alone. There are other feelings that go on with it. And the more we understand those feelings and can identify those feelings, the better chance we have of analyzing those relationships and dealing with our anger more responsibly. If you continue to get yourself in trouble with your anger in relationship after relationship, you may want to go back into your early experiences and more clinically deal with some material to find out where that's coming from. And if you can't do this yourself, you may want to get some professional help and understanding and getting more in depth. But the whole idea is taking this feeling and taking this emotion and using it responsibly in all of your relationships. Okay? Any questions? No questions. Thank you.